Okay, our speaker this evening is Alexander Lucie-Smith. He's a writer, a speaker, and a Catholic priest. Now, the last time we had a Catholic priest at Dorset Humanists was many years ago, and in fact he was a Catholic bishop, and he'd spent many years in Rome, but he had lost his faith, and he'd become a humanist, and he joined Dorset Humanists. So Alexander, it's very dangerous. Yes. And it was so many years ago, I can't even remember his name. I'd have to really delve back into the records. And I'm sure he's no longer with us, because he was quite elderly when he joined. So I just thought I'd warn you. Okay. You know. Alexander has a doctorate in ethics, and he's interested in the writings of Saint Augustine and in the moral philosophy of John Rawls and Alasdair Macintyre. And tonight he's going to talk to us about St. Thomas Aquinas. So will you please give him a very warm welcome.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm an expert supposedly on St. Augustine, not St. Thomas Aquinas. But I think it's a good thing to talk about St. Thomas Aquinas because everybody needs to know a little bit about him. Everybody's heard of him. We might be a bit hazy about the facts. Let's start with a fun fact about St. Thomas Aquinas. He did not look like that at all. He was enormously fat. And allegedly, when he sat down at the refectory table, they had to carve out sort of a half moon at his seat, so he would sort of get his legs under the table. And he never really said anything, and people would look at him and sort of say, you know, what's the point of this bloke? And his teacher, who was called Albertus Manius, said, you may not look like much now, but when the bull roars, the earth shall shake. And so it proved. That's the only fun fact about St. Thomas Aquinas. Okay? So the rest of this talk is going to be incredibly boring. He was born in 1225 and he died in 1274. So he was roughly 49 when he died. So rather a short life. He was born in a place called Roccasecca, which means dry hill, dry mount. And I've been to the castle of Roccasecca. It's really in the middle of nowhere. It's halfway between Rome and Naples, so it sounds like somewhere, but it's very, very remote to get to. And it's just a small village with a ruined castle on the hill. Now, in the year his father was the Count of Aquino, that's why he's called Thomas Aquinas. In the year 1225, it's important to stress, Italy did not exist except as a geographical expression. Europe did not exist except as a geographical expression. And Thomas Aquinas, and this is also rather difficult to get our heads around, wrote in Latin. Well, everybody wrote in Latin in those days, fine. But he didn't just write in Latin, he thought in Latin and wrote it down as he thought it. And also he spoke Latin. Now, it's true that when he went out to, let's say, the tavern, he would have given his order for beer in vulgar Latin, i.e. Italian, or if he was in Paris, in French. But really, his language was Latin. Now, he was sent off, he was educated as a little boy at Monte Cassino, where the famous battle was in the Second World War. And he must have had quite a good education, although the education would be heavily classical, it would be Latin, 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 day in, day out. Then he was bundled off aged about 15, in those days that was quite normal, to the University of Naples, which is still there. And then after that he was sent off to Paris, where he finished off his studies and he started to teach. Then from Paris he went to Rome, where he did some more teaching. Then he went back to Paris. Incidentally, the University of Paris he went to is what we nowadays call the Sorbonne, and in the Latin Quarter, where everybody spoke Latin. The teaching in those days was completely different to the teaching nowadays. It was largely lecture and people taking notes, and then there was another major component, was what's called in Italian la disputa, in Latin disputatio. That is to say, it's not really debate. It was rather you'd get the pupils and you'd give one a little piece of paper on which there'd be a proposition. And then you'd give another bloke a bit of paper on which there was another proposition. And you'd say to him, right, speak. And he'd have to speak for 10 minutes or whatever on that proposition. And then you'd point to somebody who said, sed contra, and that guy would have to stand up and he'd have to give the opposite side of the coin to what that guy had just said. and that was called a disputatio. And that would be quite difficult to do, and that would all have been done in Latin. This sed contra, on the other hand, was very important. And the other thing that was very important was, of course, distinguo, which I make a distinction. So, for example, somebody says some word there, and you say distinguo. When you use that word, do you mean it in this sense, or do you mean it in that sense? And so it went on. Thomas Aquinas' greatest achievement, what was it? It was this. He introduced into academic discourse the works of Aristotle. Now, Aristotle had been totally forgotten in the West from quite early on. For example, Saint Augustine never mentions Aristotle in his works at all. Saint Augustine didn't speak Greek anyway, probably, we're not sure. Aristotle had been completely forgotten in the West. But what Aquinas did is he accessed various Arab scholars who had access to Aristotle and therefore brought Aristotle back into the common European discourse. So Aristotle being forgotten, he'd gone into the Middle East where people were very keen on Aristotle, and then from the Middle East, via Spain as well, he'd come back to Paris. And therefore, Thomas Aquinas popularized Aristotle. That's rather an odd word to use with regard to Aristotle. Until then, it had all been Plato, 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 Plato. And then, of course, it's been Plato, then the Platonists, then the Neo-Platonists, and then the Neo-Neo-Platonists. And believe it or not, in France today, and well, until the 19th century, there were still various brands of Neo-Platonism still going on. Now, Plato is much more interesting than Aristotle. Plato is really rather good from the point of view of philosophy. You can read Plato and enjoy it. And the other thing about Plato is the type of books he wrote were these sort of discussions, these Platonic dialogues. They were written down as books. Aristotle came to us via the Arabs and so on. Aristotle never read a book. What we get from Aristotle is the lecture notes that his pupils took and which were then published after his death and which weren't checked over by Aristotle. And Aristotle's lecture notes are incredibly compressed and therefore they are excruciatingly boring. They are really the most boring books you've ever read in your life because they were not meant to be books, you know, they were squash, squash, squash down lecture notes, they're redactions, they're what do you call it when you boil something down really, really, you know...
Summary.
Summary, yes, summaries, yes. But really, really thick, sort of treacle rather than sort of soon. Yet, Aristotle is incredibly important. Apart from being incredibly dull, he's incredibly important. We're all Aristotelians. There are many people who are actually, you know, get paid to be an Aristotelian. There are neo-Aristotelian professors around the place. But you and I, who don't study philosophy as a way of life, we're Aristotelians. I'll give you an example. Sometimes you're in a discussion with somebody, and you will utter this phrase, "Yes, but it's not quite the same thing, is it?" Have you ever used that phrase? Yeah, all the time, I hope. Aristotle invented what we call the categories. So, for example, Aristotle said the human being is a rational animal. Species is genus plus difference. Humanus est animal rationalis. So the species is the human being, the genus is animal, we're animals, and the difference, which marks us out as different from other animals, is the fact we're rational. Now, just recently, there's been a philosopher who I'm sure you've all heard of, called Peter Singer. He's an Australian. And Peter Singer has tried to break down these Aristotelian categories because he said, dolphins are intelligent. Absolutely true. Dolphins are clearly not human. But if dolphins are intelligent and the distinguishing mark of human beings is intelligence, well, surely it's something we share with dolphins, and therefore we must share more than just intelligence with dolphins. We can't see as human beings as completely distinct from the rest of the animals. Now, the argument to be had, the discussion to be had is, well, is it quite the same thing? The rationality of dolphins and the rationality of human beings, is it quite the same thing? Are these, but Peter Singer wants to blur the categories which came down to us from Aristotle. One of the things that Aristotle did, if you remember, well, you don't remember, but nobody remembers, is he was the one who invented the classification of plants. And his greatest pupil was, of course, Alexander the Great, who, whenever he went on his travels conquering people, would find funny plants and box them up and have them sent back to Aristotle, who would then look at them and say, oh yes, I understand this comes from such and such family. So idea of families and so on and so forth. Is it the same thing? Peter Singer's got another thing, which is this. The human being has rights. The human being is a human being because the human being is rational. Fine, I'm with him in that. However, what happens when the human being stops being rational? What happens when a human being loses their faculties and they're no longer rational? Let's say they've got Alzheimer's. Do they then no longer have human rights? Good question. Also, he again uses what's called a reductio ad absurdum. He said, what happens when the human being goes to sleep? Because when the human being goes to sleep, the human being is no longer thinking. Therefore, if the human being is no longer a thinking animal when they're asleep, do they still have human rights? Do their human rights suddenly go into abeyance as soon as they fall asleep and suddenly come back into play when they wake up? And of course, somebody has pointed out that if this is true, that your human rights go into suspended animation when you go to sleep, it would be a very dangerous world if your human rights were suddenly taken away from you every time you went to sleep. You'd be very nervous about going to sleep. But the whole idea of humanity being a rational animal is not quite the same thing. Animal rights, animal welfare, and all these sort of things. These all are, we argue about these things using the categories we've received from Aristotle. Of course, Immanuel Kant was also a great one for categories. It's immensely dull, a lot of this stuff about categories, but it's actually very useful. One of the usual criticisms of Aristotle is he says something which is common sense, but it's a very roundabout way of getting through to common sense. It's immensely dull, but it is essential. The syllogisms, the logic, and so on, that is essential. Okay, so we owe Thomas Aquinas a debt of gratitude for bringing back Aristotle into play. In theology, Thomas Aquinas said something incredibly important, which is still incredibly important if one wants to understand religion. And if one wants to understand, once again, it's not exactly the same thing. If one wants to understand that many religions are profoundly divided from each other by matters which go right down to the root of everything. Now, Thomas Aquinas said, gratia naturam supponit et perfecit eam. Grace presupposes nature and brings it to perfection. Now, it makes lovely sense in Latin because supponit. In other words, supponit, it means grace assumes nature exists. In other words, grace coexists with nature. Now, one of the things that Thomas Aquinas would have taught, and which I believe, is that somebody can have grace and nature at the same time. They coexist and not at each other's expense. So now this to many religious believers is absolute heresy of the first order. It's heresy to the Protestants. It's heresy to the Russian and Greek Orthodox. And above all, it's heresy to the Muslims. The Muslims, the Lutherans, the Orthodox, believe in something which is called a utterly transcendent vision of God. That is to say, the journey into God involves the annihilation of human nature. St. Thomas Aquinas believes that the journey into God brings about the fulfillment of human nature. Now, you might think this is not particularly interesting, but it's very, very interesting. Because somebody like St. Thomas Aquinas, meeting a pagan, would approve of the pagan insofar as the pagan was a good person. So if Thomas Aquinas had made it to the New World, if he'd lived a few more hundred years and seen the beautiful architecture of Chichen Itza, he would have said, wow, this is wonderful. This engineering is superb. these people are really clever, these people are really well organised, and things like that. And isn't it wonderful that they have these natural gifts? Whereas the idea of natural gifts being praiseworthy is not a Protestant idea, and it's not a Muslim idea. It's, and I can prove this if you like, if you look at the Book of Common Prayer, the bit at the back, about how you're not supposed to marry your sister and all that, the 39 articles of religion, one of them just says that there can be no good works before salvation. I.e., if you're a Protestant, the idea that you have good works that God will approve of before you're saved is complete nonsense. It just cannot be. Now, one of the things that the non-Aquinas approach says, or seems to suggest, is that to accept God into your life, as our Protestant brethren often say, first of all, you have to destroy your humanity. No Catholic believes that. No Catholic believes in this idea of you have to clear the ground of your human nature before you can accept grace. Grace presupposes nature and brings it to perfection. Nature is good. Now that is one of, I mean, it's an obvious point to me, and I hope it's an obvious point to you, that nature is good. It's one of the points that was firmly rejected at the Reformation. It was, and it's also been rejected by the Muslims, and it's also been rejected by the Russian and Greek Orthodox. The people who really hate Aquinas are the Orthodox and the Lutherans. One of the great cries of Luther at the Reformation was this: Was hat Aristoteles zu tun mit Christus? What has Aristotle got to do with Christ? Well, answer to that is not much, because Aristotle was a pagan, don't forget. Aristotle was not a Christian. He lived 200 years, or 300 years before Christ. And then Luther had as one of his great rallying cries, Los mit Aristoteles, away with Aristotle. And so Luther's people burnt all the books of Aristotle they could lay their hands on in the libraries and so on. Then after about a generation, they decided that they had to do some theology themselves, and what did they reach for to help them with their theology is their books of Aristotle, which they had burnt. Well, they got some new ones in, obviously. The Protestants rejected philosophy in religion because they said if you put philosophy into religion, religion ceases to be religion, it collapses into philosophy. And the Orthodox say exactly the same thing. And of course the Muslims would say the same thing. The Muslims say that the Quran is the uncreated work of God, the uncreated word of God. And therefore that's all you need, the word of God, any human word. Why would you want human words when you've got the word of God? I mean, it's silly, isn't it? But as a matter of fact, Aquinas is absolutely clear that when you start thinking about God, your reason does not go out of the window. Your reason and your faith engage with each other, and they are complementary. So, the single most important thing that he ever wrote, gratia naturam supponit et perfecit eam. Okay, so the idea of natural gifts, natural goodness, is, and of course the fact that people who don't believe in God can be pleasing to God, that is a Thomistic, that's the adjective you get from Thomas Aquinas, a Thomistic idea. And a very, very important one, I think. Now, an utterly transcendent view of God is difficult. It's because one of the ways, and certain Westerners, certain Catholics have this idea of an utterly transcendent view of God. We can't say anything about God, they would say. The only thing we can say about God is what he's not. We can't say anything positive about God. So they espouse something called the via negativa. So God is not this, God is not that, but we can't say anything positive about God at all. Thomas Aquinas invented something called the analogy of being. I'll get back to that if you would be so kind to get back to that. When I talk about, because I was specifically asked to talk about the 5 ways, I'll get back to the analogy of being. which meant you could talk about God, you could say something positive about God, but in analogous terms. But I'll get back to that. Now, in secular terms, what's he ever done for us? What has Aquinas ever done for us? Well, he did something very interesting. In religious terms, he did that, gratiam naturam supponit et perfectam. In secular terms, he did this. He talked about law. And he came up with a definition of law. He loved defining things. They all did. And he said, law is an ordinance of reason made by him who has care of the community and promulgated and made for the common good. Now, this definition of law, I think, is an excellent one. Why? After Thomas Aquinas did this, and this was taught in the universities, a couple of hundred years after Thomas, Thomists, followers of Thomas, stuck their oar in, and they argued that what gave law its force was the will of the lawmaker. In other words, if the law said you must do something or another, you had to do it because that is what the prince, he who has care of the community, had ordered. Now, Thomas Aquinas does not say this at all. He says law is an ordinance of reason. Ordinance is a form of words. What makes law binding on you is its rationality. And therefore, it followed from this, if a law was unreasonable, it was not binding on you. And you were free to disobey it. Moreover, he went so far as to say, if a law was unreasonable in certain circumstances, you were morally obliged to break the law. Because there was a higher law than the written law, and that law was the law of nature, which was imprinted in your rationality, and therefore, so from Thomas Aquinas we get the very important idea, and don't forget this was an awful long time ago, of conscientious objection, and the state having no right to interfere with the consciences of the subjects. So the prince can make his law, and the prince can promulgate his law. It's got to be promulgated. He can't just suddenly sneak up on you and say, hey, there's a law against this, didn't you know? No, nobody told me. In that case, that's fine, you didn't have to keep it. And you've actually got to play fair. The state has got to play fair with people. It's got to promulgate the laws. It's got to tell people what the laws are. So presumably those laws have got to be, to use a modern word, transparent. People have got to understand them. And indeed, as they're rational, and human beings are rational, the law should be understandable. But if the law is not rational, it is to be rejected. And sometimes it must be rejected. The other thing he said was, no law is definitive, because no law can foresee all circumstances. And therefore, every law has to be updated from time to time. You can't just say, well, you know, in 1642 there was a law saying blah, blah, blah. Well, that's not really good enough. It's got to be updated since then, because circumstances change. Not every law can foresee all circumstances. Now, I think this is incredibly important, because what this does is it respects human autonomy. And it places human autonomy at the centre of morality. People, for Thomas Aquinas, are not people who are told what to do. Daddy knows best, the prince knows best, and so on. And of course this was quite radical, and that's why the so-called followers of Thomas Aquinas rather broke back from this, and they wanted to make out that no, what he really said was that the prince's will was a determining factor in the law. So if the prince changes his mind, well, the law can change as well. But no, it's the rationality in the law that makes the law binding on us. Okay.
You've had 21 minutes.
Oh God, great, I'm halfway through. Well, I'm okay. So that's, I think, incredibly important, and it's often forgotten. Incidentally, this idea of the law is an ordinance of reason, made by him who has care of the community, would also be, you know, can you imagine believing that in Stalinist Russia or Nazi Germany? The other thing is, he said, it's made for the common good. If it's not for the common good, it is to be rejected. Now, what do you mean by the common good? Well, there is this law, well, this thought process we have today, which is widely shared, when you look at a law, a proposed law, ask yourself what its impact will be on the most vulnerable in society. If it's going to have a bad impact on them, then think again, come up with another law, please. So that's one thing it's saying. It's also saying that I suppose it could say, well, this law is going to have a good impact on 90% of the population, but 10% will suffer. But the balance of probabilities are that everybody will benefit. Let's say taxation. If you're very, very rich, you pay more taxes than anybody else, don't you? But if the law of taxation, that's progressive taxation, I think it's called, that's what we accept. We justify that for the common good, saying, yeah, this is in accordance with the common good, because even if you're a multi-millionaire and you pay tons of tax, nevertheless, you benefit by paying more tax, because everybody around you is happy and things like that. So in other words, you're not victimized for the good of the others, you're benefiting as well. So in other words, every law has got to be for the benefit of the whole of society, the common good for everybody. And it's a well-known fact that the type of law, let's say the Nuremberg laws of Hitler, which victimized a small minority of the country, were bad for that small minority, but they were bad for everybody as well. And therefore, if it's bad for a small minority, it's bad for everybody. If it's good for a lot of people, it should be good for absolutely everybody. And therefore, we must be very wary of the laws that are not for the good of everybody, not for the common good. So that is one of the ways we can, it's a sort of a mental thought process, a thought process that can be used to criticize the laws. Incidentally, Thomas Aquinas is a great believer in rules, but he also, as we said, not every rule can foresee all circumstances. What happens when circumstances arise when there are no rules? And this happened, I think, during the pandemic. You know, what were the rules? Well, the last pandemic was the Spanish flu. We'd all forgotten about the Spanish flu. What do we do now? One of the things is that he would say, following Aristotle, is virtue ethics. We practice the virtues of temperance, prudence, the biggest virtue of all, and the other three, which I can't quite remember. Temperance, prudence, fortitude, and justice. Now, if you actually were facing a pandemic, that'd be quite a good way to approach it. Right, temperance, fortitude, let's all, be brave. Prudence, let's all have a think. And justice, let's give to each person what each person needs and deserves. That's a good way of looking at it. Okay, now I'm going to go on to something a bit particular, which is the very opening thing of the Summa Theologiae, which was his most famous work, his biggest work. And I mean big. I mean, it's about 60 volumes. It's not just a one book, it's about a whole wall of a library. Incidentally, I imagine a lot of you might have read that book, or have a copy of it. You might not have read it, but you have a copy of it and you've dipped into it. It's a very good book. It's written by, senior moment here.
Alasdair Macintyre?
No, not Alasdair, a long time ago. A guy who was the leader of CND. Bertrand Russell, History of Western Philosophy.
Right.
In the History of Western Philosophy, he talks about the Summa Contra Gentiles, which is a much inferior book and not so interesting. He ignores the Summa Theologiae, saying it's a book of theology. Well, it is a book of theology, but it's 100% theological, it's also 100% philosophical, it's both. And the Summa Theologiae is by far the greater book. The Summa Contra Gentiles, it's a bit, pedestrian. Okay, here am I calling Thomas Aquinas pedestrian. He was 49 when he died. 9 years younger than I am now. Lord help us. Okay, the Summa Theologiae starts off with a question. It's always questions, then it's an answer, then it's sint contra. On the other hand, then it's, I make a distinction, and then it's a sort of in a conclusion. Every question. I can't remember how many questions there are in it. The first question is, an Deus sit? What does an Deus sit mean? It's often translated as, does God exist? That translation is mistaken. An, if, Deus, God, sit, be. It's the it's the third person present subjunctive. So whether God could be, or he's not saying, if he wanted to say, does God exist, he would have said, an Deus est. but he didn't. I think this is a very, I mean, you know, he invented the distinction. I think this is rather, it sounds like an incredibly tenuous distinction, but it's actually quite important. Now, for Thomas Aquinas, to ask if God exists was a nonsensical question. It would be good to ask this question: does that chair exist? And the answer he would give is yes, it does exist, because I can see it, I can smell it, perhaps, I can touch it, I can taste it if I wanted to have a lick of the chair. In other words, my senses tell me that that chair exists. Nil in intellectu nisi prima in sensu. There's nothing in your head that wasn't first in your senses. That chair is in my head, the idea of the chair, because I can actually touch it, feel it, so that chair does exist. It really does, you know, okay. I don't think there's any serious argument that that chair exists. That chair is therefore an existing thing in the world. Now, Thomas Aquinas would not have accepted, or he would not have thought about, and he would have rejected the idea that God is an existing thing in the world. Because if you say God is an existing thing in the world, then he's not God. Because God does not exist in the way that that chair exists. But we nevertheless say God is. But when we say the chair is, blah, 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 the chair is green, God is good. When I use is of the chair and is of God, I use the same word, but I use them analogously. I don't use them in the same sense. So that's what's called the analogy of being. So when he says God is X, he doesn't mean God is an existing thing in the world. Now, I do realize, and here we go to somebody who obviously thought about this as well, Wittgenstein, die Welt ist all der Fall ist. The world is all that is the case. So God is not in the world, God is not the case. Full stop. And Wittgenstein also said right at the end, if you remember, of the Tractatus Logicus Philosophicus, wovon man kann nicht sprechen, darüber muss man verschweigen. Of that which we cannot speak, we must pass over in silence. God is not an existing thing in the world. We can't say anything about him, therefore that's it. Stay stumm on the question of God. Some people think this is really great. You know, some Catholics say, "Oh, he was so wonderful, Wittgenstein, so transcendental, so mystical." When they're rubbish, and Wittgenstein saying God does not exist. Full stop. You know, okay, God is outside the world. In which case, forget about it, because everything that's in the world is the case, and that which is outside the world, which is not the case. Well, you know, what is it then if it's not the case? And we can't speak about it because, you know, it's pointless us sitting around talking about what's not the case, not in the world. Now, what Aquinas would have said is God is not an existing thing in the world, because don't forget, existing things are bound by space and time. So that chair is, you know, 1 foot across and 2 foot high, whatever. You can't say God is 1 foot across and 2 foot high. And that chair is here and now in 2021. God is outside time, God is outside space. So God's not an existing thing in the world. What is God? He would say, God is the ground of our existing. So God is not an existing thing in the world. God is the reason why things exist in the world. God is the condition of possibility of things existing in the world. God is that which holds the world in being. Now, so he's not asking if God exists, but and then he doesn't say the proof of the existence of God. He says 5 ways. And he counts them off on his fingers. And the 5 ways are the argument from the first mover, the argument from causation, the argument from contingency, the argument from degree, and the argument from the teleological argument, as it's called, the final cause. Okay. Now, at the end of each way, he says, and this is what people call God. But he doesn't say it is God. And he's not talking about Christians, he's talking about people in general. And so what he's actually talking about is perhaps the God of the philosophers. In other words, the sort of God that Aristotle believed in. And Aristotle was pretty close to being an atheist. And Plato was pretty close to being an atheist. In other words, now this argument, the first mover, which is the very first one, so he probably put it first because he thought it was most important. He starts off by saying everything that moves is moved by something else. Therefore, if we see movement all around us, things are moving, planets, etc., etc., something must have started off this movement, and you can't have a regression to infinity. Therefore, the first mover exists, and this is what people call God. Now, this argument, finito, collapsed. It's not interesting anymore, because the first sentence is wrong. Everything that is moved by something else. Wrong. According to Newton, everything that moves itself. The planets are moving themselves, the force of gravity and so on. Do you remember Newton? Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night, and God said, let Newton be. And all was light. Okay. So that was fine. Alexander Pope. It's a good one. So the first mover argument is blown out of the water. Then there's the argument from causation. Everything that we see has got a cause. And the causes also have causes, but there can't be a regression to infinity, so there must be a first cause that started off all this causation, and that is something we call God. Again, this one doesn't really go down particularly well these days, because we think of things as causing themselves, and of course people have also said the theory of, what's it called?
Quantum something or other.
Yeah, Darwin and so on, so forth. That's it. Okay. The next one is, the third one is the argument from contingency. This one's much more complicated. I think it is anyway. So everything you see that exists doesn't have to exist. It could not exist. So, but for something to exist, something has to exist before it. Contingent being, that which doesn't have to exist, relies on absolute being, something that does exist and has to exist. And the absolute being that presupposes contingent being is what people call God. That's an old argument, and that's still got quite a lot of mileage left in it, at least among philosophers. The difference between contingent being and absolute being. You see, we could all, that chair does not have to exist. I don't have to exist. But is it possible to imagine nothing existing? Surely something's got to exist, and the something that has got to exist ultimately is what people call God. Then he's got the argument from degree. This one hasn't aged particularly well. This one's vaguely related to the argument put forward by Anselm of Bec, which has also exercised philosophers for many, many a year. And that is the argument for degree. We see good, better, best in the world. Now, this is a good orange, that's a better orange, and that's a really great orange. And therefore there is a hierarchy of goodness. And at the top of the hierarchy, there's the absolute goodness, and that's what people call God. And then finally, he comes to the teleological argument. And this one, again, this one attracts a lot of attention still. Now, he says everything that exists has a purpose. And it's a final cause. It's there for a reason. And there must be something that has given everything in the universe a reason to be. And that final cause is what people call God. Now, the teleological argument has come into terrible pounding in recent years. The idea that a thing has a purpose has been hugely discredited. People have gone to war over this one, if you see what I mean, so far as philosophers go to war. They say, no, it has not a purpose, you give it the purpose. So an acorn has no purpose, it's you give it a purpose, and whereas Thomas Aquinas would definitely say an acorn has a purpose, which is to grow into an oak tree, and then to produce more acorns, and then so on and so forth. Let's try and think of this idea of purpose. It generally breaks down to, yes, what is the purpose of food? Well, Thomas Aquinas said the purpose of food is to nourish the human body and to enable people to stay alive. I'm sure he'd say something like that. Is that the purpose of food? Or does food have a purpose insofar as I say it has a purpose? Am I in a world where everything is neutral, every fact is neutral, everything is neutral and I give it purpose, or is purpose intrinsic to things? Now, this is a massive philosophical problem today, a philosophical discussion. It's difficult because it can collapse into what's called biologism, which is, biologism is discredited amongst absolutely everybody, by the way. There's nobody, maybe some people believe in biologism, but no Catholic believes in biologism, you'll be glad to know. Biologism says things like, they used to say things like, well, you know, it used to say things like, homosexuality does not exist in animals. Oh, therefore, it shouldn't exist in humans. Well, that's crap, you know, because it's also crap because, first of all, if that were true, it's still crap. But it's crap because it does exist in animals, it's funny enough. And the teleological argument, the physical argument, is not binding on us. You know, well, if God had meant us to fly, he'd have given us wings. Oh, come on, please. But the teleological argument, okay, the human mind, has the human mind got a natural, intrinsic desire to know the truth? Or is that just something that we have invented for ourselves individually? Or were you born with an inquiring mind? Is your mind naturally inquiring? It's a difficult one. What is your purpose in life? Oh, well, whatever you want your purpose to be. Or is it, no, your purpose in life is to know the truth? That's what Thomas Aquinas would say. Human beings are created with a desire and a purpose of knowing the truth. Is there such a thing as truth? Oh yes, says St. Thomas Aquinas, most definitely, and human beings are made for it. And in fact, there's an absolute truth as well. Human beings are made for that, and they go on massive quests to know the truth. Or is truth, like the Holy Grail, something, a mirage, something that you've decided you'll go looking for, but does not actually exist in reality? That's the teleological argument, you see. Now, I personally believe that there are some facts which are malleable, infinitely adjustable. You know, it can be whatever you want it to be, but there are also certain things that are fixed, and there is an idea of human nature which is fixed. But other things are, you know, make of it what you will. But I certainly believe that human beings were born with a desire to know the truth, and that the truth exists, which is essentially the actual summing up St. Thomas Aquinas in a nutshell, by the way. So, he's frequently misunderstood. What's that?
40 minutes.
Oh my goodness, well, I was told to go on for 45 minutes or something, so I think I'm more or less finished. He was frequently misunderstood. He produced a huge amount of stuff. He's still with us, believe it or not, I think, in many ways, because in case he was a man who lived his entire life in a lecture room in a library, but bits do seep out into the conversation. So I do hope that, having talked to you for 40 minutes about Thomas Aquinas, you now feel that you know a little bit more about him than you did when you came in. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Alexander. You could have gone on for another 9 minutes, but anyway, I'm sure you've given us enough to spark some questions.
The worst talks are the ones where there are no questions at all.
Well, yes, that's very, very rare for Dorset Humanists. So I'm going to kick off with just something that reminded me, I mean, when you were talking about him, it reminded me of an evangelical sort of philosopher that I was reading when I was in my teens and 20s. There was a chap called Francis Schaeffer, I don't know if you've ever come across him, Protestant evangelical philosopher. And he wrote this sort of brief synopsis of a history of sort of Western philosophy, but from an evangelical point of view. And he said, the rot set in with Thomas Aquinas. And so it was very interesting, you know, that you know, when you were saying that yes, that the Lutherans can't stand him. Because he sort of introduced this idea of autonomous reason. And I think this guy, Francis Schaeffer, was saying, look what, look where that led to, atheism, So maybe we've got some things in common with Aquinas.
Yeah.
But anyway, I don't know if you wanted to comment on that, or we can open it up.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things they say, particularly the Orthodox, they say that he was rationalistic. Rational, here, everybody's supposed to be rational there, but he was rationalistic. And he introduced rationalism into religion and therefore watered down religion fatally and essentially killed it off. Which you could, all I would, and then of course people like the Greek Orthodox, the Russian Orthodox, and indeed the Muslims, and indeed our evangelical brethren, do sort of say the heart of religion is mysticism and ecstasy. And yet, funnily enough, the thing that people forget about Thomas Aquinas is he did frequently go into ecstasy. I don't know if you've ever come across anybody who does this then. Just leave them alone if you think they've gone into ecstasy. He did, and especially towards the end of his life, he went into ecstasy on frequent occasions. I mean, he was only 49. And when he was dying, he said, "You must burn the Summa Theologiae, because it is straw. In other words, it's all rubbish. In other words, God is much greater than anything human beings can express." So there is a mystical side to St. Thomas Aquinas. Those people who accuse him of rationalism do an injustice.
Okay, Sally, I think your hand's going up.
Hello,
Yes,
Sally.
thank you, very interesting. Just something you were saying towards the end about this argument about whether things have, everything in the world has a purpose, or everything in the world doesn't have a purpose. Surely some philosopher might actually say some things in the world have purpose and other things in the world don't have purpose.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, what is the purpose of that chair you're sitting in? Was it destined from all eternity to have you sitting in it? Or was it made for you? No, clearly not. It could be made for anything, couldn't it? It could eventually be firewood. So yes, there's certain things do have a purpose, and other things we give purpose to, because we are creatures who make things, and therefore we create purpose among other things.
And I mean, one could say that the acorn had a purpose. Well, I mean, you might argue about purpose being metaphorical from a evolutionary point of view. But I mean, yes, I would agree with you. In a sense, the acorn has the purpose to grow up and be an oak tree. But an acorn is a biological. It has life. Does a mountain have a purpose? And I would say a mountain doesn't have a purpose.
No, it's inanimate, isn't it?
Yes, it's inanimate. So only animate things. Or things that are made by animate people.
I suppose something like Aquinas would have said, well, nature is there to serve the human race. So the mountains are there to catch rainwater and to provide rivers, which enable us to have cities and things like that. He would take that sort of thing. It's a long
I would disagree with him on that.
Yes. I mean, I think mountains are just there, aren't they? But we certainly make use of them.
Yes.
And so they are useful to us. One could repurpose the whole argument by saying, does everything have a use? Does everything have a legitimate use, and does everything have an illegitimate use? Something like that, I don't know. Which would lead us into the heartlands of morality, wouldn't it?
All right, lots of hands going up. So let's go to Barry next. Barry.
Hi, thank you very much. Oh, teeth I leave about. Yes, well, you said so many things that I'm sure I'll ask you questions all night. On the question of causation that we were talking about here, teleology. Yes. Don't you think a more coherent explanation is that if your brain is designed to seek causation, you will find causation in things that don't really exist, or you will create a world of causation, or philosophy of causation, simply because that is the way you're programmed. We need to find the causes of things, often assigning causes when they don't exist. So isn't this just the simple explanation for our affinity, our lust for causation? Is that just the way we're programmed? We look for causes, even when they're not there, when they're blatantly not there.
You speak like a medieval Franciscan. Occam's razor. Why invent something that's not needed? Why don't you say, well, this has no cause at all? I mean, Aristotle, to go back to Aristotle, says that, what's the purpose of human life? The purpose of human life is to sit around in a city-state and discuss philosophy. That's what Aristotle really says. And I wonder, you know, I don't know. I think, certainly one thing I would agree with you on, we do have a pretty good track record on attributing the wrong cause to something. But teleology, I mean, it's awful when you feel like a spare part, when you feel like a fish out of water, when you feel, what am I doing here in this world? I've got no place here. And, you know, as some teenagers do, and other people as well. When nihilism is pretty nihilistic. So we all want a cause which points us in the right direction, and we want to feel part of something that's pointing us. So let's say if you're one of Aristotle's gentlemen, you sit around in the city-state and you are building up the city-state with your discussion of philosophy and so on and so forth. We all want to be part of something. We all, you know, we are political animals. We love the polis, the city-state. I don't know, are we naturally political animals, or is it just something we've invented for ourselves to make ourselves feel better? I really don't know.
Can I offer an alternative
Yeah.
to this feeling that there must be a reason
Yeah.
to life?
Yeah.
If you're born,
Yeah.
you have won the most incredibly unlikely lottery ticket imaginable statistically. If you're born in England, in the last 50 years, you're living in a country of incredible peace, prosperity, stress-free life. You don't want to admit it, but it's a stress-free life. So you've won 2 lotteries in a row. What more do you want?
Absolutely. And why are we
living in Bournemouth?
Another lottery.
Thomas Aquinas, of course, in his morality, says that if he proposes what's called the ethics of beatitude, the ethics of happiness, that all the moral rules point us towards happiness and a happy and fulfilled life. Why, I would just sort of wang back at you this question, the most developed country in the world is Sweden, okay? Yeah, you know, so Britain's not far behind. Why are we so unhappy? Because there are an awful lot of unhappy people around here. I lived in Africa for 4 years. The idea of somebody committing suicide in Africa was incomprehensible. They just couldn't understand it. And St. Thomas Aquinas also said that suicide is against human nature. But why do we do it so often? Why are there so many unhappy people? So we've got great developments, haven't we? But we're not the happiest of people.
Well, I'm not sure that happiness and causation are necessarily related. Teleology.
Teleology and happiness do go together. Happiness is discovering your inner telos. I would have thought that's what he would have said. That to be human flourishing is happiness, and human flourishing is living to the fullest potential of your telos, of your
I find
inner.
that very tenuous, but you've got a lot of people.
Simon, I didn't quite understand your
Sorry, I was
side.
actually saying that since David has lectured a whole course on the happiness course,
right, yes.
you might want to...
Who has? Oh, yes, I have.
Oh.
Well, no, I would say, what I know about science, the so-called science of happiness, yes, purpose and meaning is certainly an important ingredient in one's happiness. So I was agreeing basically with what you were saying.
Good. There you go.
John Kingston.
Thank you, first of all. It was really, really interesting. I was just thinking during a lot of your talk, wondering what your own view of God is. I mean, it's a big question, and you probably haven't got time to talk about it. But you know, Thomas Aquinas. Most people think of Thomas Aquinas as you suggested, the proving God's existence in a number of ways. You don't accept that. But you know, what's your idea of God and why?
I suppose I would be going with
In about 10 words.
I'd go with the ground of our being, the reason why anything is, the one who calls us, the one who created us, and the one who calls us. But God, I would also go with Plato's definition of God. God is the ideal form. He is truth, ideal beauty, and ideal whatever the other one is called. Truth, beauty, and ideal being. He is, but above all, ideal beauty is what I would say God is, an ideal truth. In other words, that which I aspire to.
Yes.
That my deepest aspiration. I don't really know.
Well, that's an idea.
Yeah.
But so I mean, I don't want to argue with you at all.
Yeah.
I'm just very interested in what your idea of God is. So that's an idea, which
Yeah.
sounds like a
Yeah.
pretty lovely idea.
Yeah, but it's a person, not
But
just
do you
an idea.
have any evidence that that is the case? Or I mean, I'm not sure what sort of evidence you could have.
I haven't been looking for the evidence. I don't know the answer to this question. I think it's good that I don't know the answer to this question. Yes, I would say God is what I'm seeking, you see, because once you think you've found God, it's not God. You're always seeking, there's always further to go. I think also that this is interesting. The God as something transcendental is what I've really talked about. God is also immanent, i.e. here with us on this earth, because he's present in the life of Jesus Christ, and also his graces are present in the lives of the saints. Now, Catholicism, of course, is, as many as the Muslims criticise the Catholics, and so do the Muslims, and all the rest of them, not the Orthodox, criticise us for being obsessed with the saints. But we see the finger of God working in the lives of the saints, and that's how you feel about God. You know, you see, he is here working in this world. He's immanent, and that's one of the things that we owe from Aquinas and Aristotle rather than Plato.
So would you say, Alexander, I mean, the question, does God, if someone says to you, does God exist, it sounds as though you and Aquinas would almost say that's not quite the right question.
Not quite the right question.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, yes, but that's not quite the right question. Yeah. Does God exist? You know, yes, but not in the way we're thinking.
Because it's not like
he's
a
not an
chair,
existing
so-
thing in the world. No.
Okay.
No.
Let's bring Jeremy in, but before we bring... Jeremy, did you want to ask a question?
No, just to...
But before I allow you to ask a question, I just want to say that a few years ago, Jeremy said to me, Aristotle's Nicomachean, if that's the right way to pronounce it, ethics is well worth a read. And I tried...
if you are an insomniac.
And I tried reading it about a year ago, and it's one of the few books I've got halfway through and kind of stopped.
You did well.
Because it was, I was so pleased you said it was excruciating.
Excruciating.
I will try again.
But believe it or not, I mean, they always say read the books rather than books about books, but if you want to read about Aristotle, the best person to tackle that is Freddie Copplestone, FCC Copplestone, History of Philosophy. There's a volume about Aristotle, there might be even more, and that's very accessible, because Freddie did the spade work for you.
Okay.
So he makes it digestible.
Thank you for that. Right, okay, sorry. Jeremy.
I was just going to say, sorry, do you mind if I stand up? Because I control my breathing a bit better if I stand up. I was rather interested in your comparison, a brief one, between Plato and Aristotle.
Yeah.
And also, by extension, Thomas Aquinas as well. Because Plato, in my view, was a very much more mystical philosopher, certainly than Aristotle.
Oh, yes.
And Aristotle's main achievement, in my view, was to cut away, to get rid of all that mysticism which is embedded, particularly in the theory of forms, Plato's all that kind of stuff. The interesting thing that I find with Aquinas is that he's kind of adopted Aristotle's teleology. Almost in toto, completely. I mean, except for the obsession he has with proving that God exists, and sort of messing around with the teleological argument to incorporate consideration of God. It's amazing, the debt that he owes to Aristotle. And I just wanted to know whether you agree.
Well, yes and no. Said contra. Distinct. One of the things about Aristotle is he talks about God as the unmoved mover of all things. And God is the one who gives movement to the entire world. He's at the centre of the whole caboodle of moving wheels and cogs, if you think of it that way. But of course, God is, he also describes God as a thinking about a thinking about a thinking. He's unmoved. He has no feelings. He has no emotions. He doesn't go out to people. He doesn't think about people. He is perfect, having everything inside him. Therefore, he thinks, which is the perfect activity. He has thought, the perfect activity. He's thinking. What's he thinking about? Himself, the perfect object. And so Aristotle's God is is sort of solipsistic, I think is the word. He's completely self-obsessed. Whereas, of course, the Christian God is the God of love. Now, for Aristotle, love was not a good thing at all. Alasdair Macintyre, who I know some of you have read, he has a wonderful phrase. He says, Aristotle would not have approved of Jesus Christ at all. And he would have been horrified by St. Paul. And, of course, because these people talked about loving the unfortunate. Aristotle thought the unfortunate, put them on a mountainside and kill them by exposure, things like that. The unfortunate, well, they're slaves, aren't they? But they deserve to be slaves and so on. So Aristotle, women, I mean, you know, for goodness sake, let them take part in politics, don't be ridiculous. Aristotle would not, the idea that the thinking man, the citizen, had a duty to the slaves and the women and the children and so on would be anathema to Aristotle. It's beneath your notice.
I'm very aware of that.
Yeah, I know you are. Yeah.
I wasn't making a point at all.
Yeah, I know. I mean, you were making a very good point. But that is, of course, the huge difference between the God of Aristotle and Aristotle's more or less an atheist.
Well, I wouldn't even say that Aristotle had any real conception of the God as such.
No.
I mean, his conception of God or divinity was very, very abstract.
Very tenuous, very abstract.
Nebulous.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it was nebulous, and he lived happily, I think, with his plants and his things like that, and his lectures, and he didn't think about God at all. I don't think Aristotle, I suppose what we could say about Aristotle, he wasn't religious.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Plato probably was mystical then, but whether Plato was religious or not in the accepted way. I think Virgil was almost certainly religious.
Oh, Virgil's a different kettle.
Yeah, it's a completely different kind of. I think Virgil was quite pious, but Aristotle certainly had no piety.
And how about Socrates?
Goodness knows. No, well, he was executed for atheism, wasn't he? I mean, I don't know about Socrates. We know very little about Socrates. All we know about Socrates is what Plato tells us. So he existed.
Xenophon as well.
Right, okay. Sorry, I don't know your name, Nigel. Nigel.
What became of Thomas Aquinas? Is his place of burial celebrated? Or?
God, I'm trying to think where it is. Well, what became of him is he died at Fossa Nuova, which is north of Rome. And of course, by this time he was enormous. And then there was a huge quarrel about what to do with him. And so they boiled him down to make him more manageable. And I think eventually, I have a funny feeling he's buried in Toulouse. Because I think I've been there. I'm not sure though. He might be buried in Toulouse. But one of the things is about, as you know, Catholics are obsessed with relics. If you think that, you're completely correct. The famous, I mean, Saint Augustine's tomb is. I've been to Saint Augustine's tomb. It's in Pavia, and I went there, and I just didn't feel much of a blip. Whereas I've seen the tombs of people like, you know, well, some of those tombs, and where there has been a big blip. So some saints don't really float people's boats, and their tombs are not particularly important. Others are the source of endless book, which I don't know if you know. You might have heard of the famous Padre Pio, who was banished by his superiors to a ghastly place called San Giovanni Rotondo. Now, where he's now buried, where he spent his entire life, and they now get something like 7 million or 12 million visitors a year. They had to build a high-speed train. But they sent him to the middle of nowhere, and now he's got a high-speed train. It's great.
Now, some humanists have been known to have relics.
Of what?
Well,
Charles Bradlaugh.
no, see,
What is it?
now, Lynn, do tell us about your relic, just very briefly.
Yes, but this is my mother.
Oh.
When she stuffed it, we heard about this system that they take the ashes and they turn it into a diamond.
Oh, I see,
So-
yeah.
And it has magical powers.
Oh. But it's not her, is it?
No, but I sense her being, coming down. Sometimes I come to some traffic lights and I say turn to green.
I did the same thing. Good. That is, if you like, the sort of how it seeps out. That's how relics seep out now. Don't forget this idea that we've had. It's grown very much. Visiting the First World War cemeteries. That's sort of going to see the relics, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. Now, as David and Paul, I saw your hands go up earlier. Sally, we'll get back to you. David, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask or make a statement and see what you think about it. That we, as human beings, we're no different to other animals. cats or dogs, in that what exists inside us is a peristaltic tube called a stomach.
Okay.
And our whole existence is keeping that peristaltic tube happy. So that's what our arms are for, our legs are for, our eyes are for, to feed it. And if we don't feed it,
It's bad news.
we're not happy.
Yeah.
Because it's got to do that, and all other animals do that. So everything that we do is all predicated around this thing.
Yeah.
And if it dies, we die.
Yeah.
But
That's-
all that we do is just to keep that tube happy. And in that way, we're no different to the cat or the dog or the squirrel or anything else. So if we have religion, we invent that as part of this whole ethos of keeping this tube happy.
Okay. Two things there. First of all, I agree with you about cats. I really don't like them. Okay. I agree with you about cats. They eat their own weighted food every week and so on and so forth. They live to eat and sleep, and that's what a cat does. As for human beings, it isn't quite the same thing. The range of emotions that human beings feel is rather different. The fact that human beings have language makes them rather different. The fact that human beings have a sense of the past and a sense of the future and can look forward and look back and so on and so forth is rather different. So clearly the cat and I are both animals, but I am a rational animal in a way that the cat is different to the cat. So, you know, again we go back to this Aristotelian thing. It isn't quite the same thing. The other thing you said was, have we invented religion as a way of feeding ourselves or helping ourselves along the way to keep alive? And that's an argument. So they invented religion to as a social glue, shall we say? So people needed to live together, they needed to cooperate together. So they invented religion to enable cooperation. Ooh, that doesn't sound particularly good, does it? Yeah, because most people spend all their time quarrelling about religion. However, all I would say about that, and I had a point. What was my point about that? How is it that so many religious people have sacrificed their lives for a higher good? Where does altruism, where does sacrifice come from? Why is it that so many religious people have quite literally starved themselves and dedicated themselves to things that were not the stomach and things that were not physically satisfying for what they saw as the good of God or for the spreading of the gospel, the good of the church? People like St. Francis of Assisi, who started off as a fun-loving young man, but then turned into an ascetic, as opposed to aesthete. Started off as an aesthete, turned into an ascetic. So why do so many human beings turn their back on not the soft life, but just the normal life of looking after the body?
Here's an answer.
Oh, yeah.
Well, part of our mental makeup,
Yeah.
the design of this thing in your head, this
Yeah.
computer, highly flawed, is that we are capable of tremendous delusion. We can convince ourselves of the most remarkable things.
Yeah.
And one of them is that there's a life after death that will
Yeah.
be better, that you will have to pay for in this life by suffering.
Yeah.
You can work that delusion up and happily kill yourself.
Yeah. A lot
That's the
of
answer.
people are deluded. I completely accept that. I mean, there are lots of
Well, we're
delusions
all
around.
deluded in
Yeah.
some way.
Yeah.
In fact, our consciousness might be one great big delusion.
Let's say that. I mean, let's say, yeah.
Probably.
Yeah. What I would say is that the idea of eternal life and going to heaven is not really that big a thing with the people I know and with myself. It's the here and now that really counts.
But the people who starved themselves on a mountaintop, it was
Like
probably
St. Francis.
It was probably a big thing for them.
It might have been a bigger thing for him, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, the life of St. Francis makes remarkable reading. I don't know.
Paul, did you still have a question?
Yes, I do. Thank you for the talk.
My
Most
pleasure.
illuminating. My question is about civil disobedience, so it's a bit less philosophical perhaps than the others. If medieval Europe is anything like 21st century England, there was probably quite a lot of stuff going on that wasn't for the common good. So under those circumstances, did Aquinas sort of take his views any further? I mean, did he have rich patrons who he recommended how to resist and things like that.
I mean, he was really very much concerned with the theory and not the practice.
I feel this much.
Yeah, I mean, because he didn't get out much. I mean, he spent his entire life, which wasn't very long, in the groves of academia. He hardly ever got out. Now, there were quite a lot of people around at that time, 13th century, wasn't it, who took that path of civil disobedience, as we would call it now. And I'm thinking particularly of those people who are in that wonderful book. I don't know if you've read it. It's a wonderful book. It's a wonderful film. Senior moment here. The Name of the Rose. The Dulcinians. And the Dulcinians declared war on society, saying, you know, the Lord Christ says blah, 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 and society's not doing it. Therefore, we are at war with society. You know, and also the Albigensians declared war on society. One of the things about the Albigensians is, and I think also that nobody quite knows what they all believe, but they seem to be against private property. Now, when you abolish private property, it becomes, you know, any sort of civil society becomes difficult. And so everybody agreed that they had to be stamped out. So that sort of, the rights of conscience there, that would be an early medieval idea of the rights of conscience. Also, there were the flagellants. Do you remember them? And they were ones who sort of opted out of society as well completely. And of course, all those who went off, like St. Francis. St. Francis opted out. Although the Dulcinians were officially followers of St. Francis, but they seemed to go too far. And amongst the followers of St. Francis, there were endless quarrels about how much property can you own, and so on. So it was all very difficult, is all I can say. But the idea of the rights of conscience is very clear in St. Thomas Aquinas, but it was really not honoured until the 20th century. And the person who honoured it, who sort of wrote it out, was a Thomist, a follower of St. Thomas, Etienne Gilson, I think he was called. Was he called that? Was he a Russian living in France? I can't remember. But he's the one who wrote, or co-wrote, the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. And that enshrines the rights of conscience, which hadn't really had much of a look in until then. I mean, to be actually enshrined.
Thank you. I'll get, yes, Sally and Dan. And Adam, did I miss you right at the beginning? I don't know if you've still got a question. No. Okay. Well, let's go to Dan and then we'll come back to Sally. So, Dan.
Yes. You said that one of his ideas was that if wealthier people paid more tax, then the people around them would be happy, and then they would be happier. I'm concerned that wealthier people might not have heard of this idea.
Actually, that was his idea as applied to the idea of progressive taxation. Now, nowadays in Catholic social teaching, any law has got to be for the good of everybody, rather than just the good of the majority. So let's say that you have a government which is elected by 1/2 of the population, and an opposition. The government has got to govern for you. People didn't vote for it as well. Simple as that. So, yeah, but rich people need to understand that. The reason you're paying a lot of tax is for your good and for everybody else's good as well. And because otherwise they won't pay it, will they? They'll go and live in Jersey or something like that.
Jeff Bezos doesn't care.
And tax avoidance or tax dodging or tax not paying is a big problem. If only the rich would pay tax willingly, we'd be in a better position. I would have thought.
Sally.
I was just wondering why it was that he was sanctified. I mean,
canonised. Yeah.
Canonised, whatever the word is.
Yeah, canonised.
Yes, I mean, why was he a saint? It sounds as though they'd already decided he was a saint before he dropped dead, rather like St. Francis. So they're all ready to sort of grab his remains and turn.
Yeah, they were very, very keen to grab the remains as soon as they could get hold of them, as soon as the breath had left the body.
Yes.
Similarly, with St. Francis was canonised about 2 or 3 years after he died. Some people were very swift to be canonised, other people not so. The thing about Thomas Aquinas, if you look at his afterlife, is that Thomas Aquinas, in this picture, he's wearing the Dominican habit. Now, his parents, the Count and Countess of Aquino, wanted him to become a Benedictine monk of Monte Cassino. They had about 5 sons, and so they could spare them. They wanted him to join Monte Cassino, which was an incredibly powerful and rich abbey, and eventually, because he was the son of the Count of Aquino, become the abbot. That was the idea. He refused, and he wanted to join the Dominicans, which had only recently been founded. Now, the Dominicans were not monks, they were friars. Now, a friar is different from a monk. A monk lives in a monastery, and that means, in those days, did landowning and money and things like that. The friars were moving around, and the friars travelled light. Also, the Dominicans had only recently been founded. It's called Ordo Predicandi, the order of preaching, and they'd only recently been founded. Now, they had huge growth as soon as, by the time of Aquinas joining them, and as soon as Aquinas was dead, the Dominicans, his fellow Dominicans, championed his cause, and they made the Summa Theologiae the textbook in the universities. Afterwards, they were the ones who made him a saint, essentially. It was their influence. Afterwards, Aquinas had huge backing from the Jesuits, who controlled most of the universities of Europe. Although the Jesuits rather twisted his teaching, as I said earlier, about conscientious objection. Then finally, in about 1890, the then Pope, Leo XIII, wrote an encyclical, a letter to the whole Catholic Church called Aeterni Patris, in which he said everybody who is studying Catholic theology needs to study Thomas Aquinas. And this led to Thomas Aquinas being regarded as the official theologian of the Catholic Church, which he's not really. There are other theologians as well, but the premier theologian, and of course, but this goes right back, because if you remember Dante, when did Dante die? Any idea? Can't remember. No. But 1400, 1300, something like that, not so long after Aquinas. Dante calls Aristotle il maestro di color che sanno, the master of them that know, and that was because of Aquinas, because nobody had heard of Aristotle before Aquinas. So Aquinas was a very, very big cheese very, very early on.
It's just the sort of, from the point of view of the holiness aspect of it, you know,
well,
I mean...
there were these mystical experiences.
Yeah, so
and the fact that he spent his entire life in study and not doing other things was presumably considered extremely admirable. Though, you know, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy.
Damn.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I was under the impression that in order to become a saint, a miracle has to be attributed to you after you die. Do you know what that might have been for him?
I don't know. It's such a long time ago. The other thing is, of course, the causes of saints nowadays is overseen by a department of the Vatican, and you have these various hoops you have to jump through. In those days, I'm not sure if the hoops were so strictly enforced and so on. And don't forget, before the time of Aquinas, people became saints just because they were acclaimed as saints. People like Saint Peter was never officially made a saint; he was just acclaimed as a saint. So I don't know. I don't know. I wouldn't say that in Catholic culture, Thomas Aquinas is regarded as a great saint. He's more regarded as a great intellectual. I mean, if you wanted for a great Catholic saint, the one you should be looking for is Saint Bernadette, who had no intellectual pretensions whatsoever, or Saint Therese of Lisieux, or people like that. Particularly Saint Bernadette.
How are we doing? Nearly there? I've got one or two.
Can I just ask a very simplistic question from an atheist point of view? Could you define what you mean by the word grace?
Good question.
Yes, that's a good one. Now, you've opened the can of worms. All the disagreements amongst Catholics, Orthodox, Protestants, and indeed Muslims, and indeed possibly Jews, are to do with grace. Grace is, in Italy, what we call the Home Office, the section that deals with courts, is called Ministerio di Grazia e Giustizia, the Ministry of Grace and Justice. Justice is, or you, off to the gallows, and grace is, we forgive you and we rehabilitate you. So that's what grace is. Grace and favour home that the Queen gives you is one you don't pay rent for, free gift. So grace is forgiveness, reconciliation, free gift. But the best way to describe grace is the friendship of God, being in a state of friendship with God. Now, our Protestant evangelical brethren often say, are you right with God? And Luther also, this comes from Luther really, and grace is what Luther experienced in his Turm Erlebnis, his tower experience. He was sitting in this tower feeling depressed, and then suddenly he felt overwhelmed by the grace of God. He felt distant from God, then he felt he was taken into the friendship of God. And Luther said that once grace came, it couldn't be lost. Or if it was going to be lost, it would be lost totally, whereas Catholics don't believe that. Catholics believe that you can be in a state of grace, friendship with God, and yet still be a sinner. Luther says you're a sinner, and then you go into a state of grace, and you stop being a sinner. It's very, very complicated. Luther's view of grace is based on what I would say is a misinterpretation of Saint Augustine, whereas the Catholic view of grace is based on what the Lutherans would say is a misinterpretation of Saint Augustine. It's actually a quarrel about Saint Augustine.
So from a very simplistic point of view again, as an atheist, we can't ever be in a state of grace, can we?
Oh, now, here we go. You've opened another can of worms. Yes, you can. Because God will look at you, and if you're a good person, he must love you.
But I'm not in friendship with him because I don't think it's that.
But
you must know why you don't think it's that.
But I think he looks at you and he loves you and thinks you're great and doing all the right things.
That's very kind of him.
And it is kind of. And he also thinks, oh yeah, hang on, somebody says, isn't she an atheist? And he says, yes, she is an atheist, but she chose to be an atheist, but he still loves you, so you're in. You know. This question came up when Columbus arrived in the New World and discovered thousands of people there who didn't know anything about God. I mean, about the Christian God and about Jesus Christ. And they said, well, are these people all damned? And then they had to work out a theology that said, no, of course not. God loves everybody, and they can't be possibly damned. It's not their fault they didn't know about the Catholic Church, etc., etc. Yes. And God loves them, and so on and so forth. And this has been. There's a huge amount written about this by a man called Rana, who is also a Thomist and a Jesuit, and who's now dead. And he calls it, oh God, what's he called it? There's a special phrase he uses, anonymous Christians. He says they're people who are anti-Christian or non-Christian, but in fact they're anonymous Christians. They don't say they're Christians, but God still loves them and has given them his grace.
But the people in South America, of course, wouldn't have had an opportunity to know about God, whereas we have, and so that's why we might be
That's
damned.
true. Yeah, that is true. But that's true.
Kathy, we're going to test you on Augustine and Aquinas and the differences between the two later. Okay, any more, or are we done? Now, Alexander, I would like to present you with this, but only if you can prove to me that this really exists. Okay.
I'll come taste it. Because nil in intellectu, nisi prima insensu. But I can tell you this is not going to go into my intellect, it's going to go into my That's all right.
Please give Alexander a big round. Into a secret. I was very alarmed when Simon said he'd got a Catholic priest to come and talk to us about Aquinas, but it's been fascinating, so thank you very much.
Good.